la parola al professor John Coughlin, Corecco's Theory of Law, a Comparative Perspective.
Eugenio Corecco stands as one of the great theorists of canon law during Vatican II's post-conciliar era. In this paper, I discuss three salient features of Corecco's theory of law. 1, canon law and communio. 2, canon law as an ordinatio fidei. And 3, canon law and Christian anthropology. I explore each of these three features from the perspective of comparative law. Specifically, I compare Corecco's theory of law with aspects of Anglo-American legal theory. At its deepest level, comparative law uncovers the fundamental theories that underpin different legal systems. The analysis promises to assist one in gaining a more ample understanding of each of the legal systems being juxtaposed. It can prove fruitful in responding to one of the central questions of the comparativist, which is to ask, what is law? Number 1, canon law and communio. Corecco's starting point for canon law is theological. In his work, The Theology of Canon Law, a methodological question, he situates canon law within Vatican II's theology of communio. He states that, and I quote, "Communio must be considered as the formal principle of canon law, that is, of the nova lex evangelii, the starting point for defining the juridical structure of canonical institutes." For Corecco, communio is the ontological ground, essence, and soul of canon law. Communio is a spiritual experience rooted in the Gospels with canonical implications. As expressed in the Greek word koinonia, the experience of communio originates in the primitive church, signifying fellowship, community, and shared faith of the disciples. The new law of the gospel is nothing less than the law of love. When asked by a lawyer which was the greatest of the 613 commandments of the Jewish law, Jesus replied that there are two: love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The communio of the new law of love is that sacred bond formed by the paradox of the cross, through which the cup of affliction becomes the blessing cup, and the sharing in death become the rising of Christ's mystical body. In reference to Lumen Gentium, Walter Casper offers this summary: the mystery of the Church consists in the access we have to the Father in the Holy Spirit through Jesus Christ, so that we may share in God's divine nature. The communio of the Church is made possible and sustained through the Trinitarian communio of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Finally, the Church as communio, as Vatican II said, is participation in the Trinitarian communio itself. End quote. This profound spiritual experience of life in the Church has significance for canon law. The preliminary note to Lumen Gentium states that communio, and I quote, is not to be understood as some vague sort of goodwill, but as something organic, which calls for a juridic structure as well as being enkindled by charity. Communio hierarchica refers to the bond between the Pope, bishops, and priests, while communio ecclesiae signifies the relationship between the particular churches. In his work on the constitutional law of the Church, Corecco directs our attention to the Christian faithful. Although he recognizes that the element of hierarchy pervades all levels of communio, Corecco states that the fundamental level of communio is the communio fidelium. As Corecco explains, and I quote, "It is necessary to keep in mind the fact that the common priesthood of all the faithful is primary with respect to the ministerial priesthood. In this sense, the latter exists only for the sake of the former," end quote. Corecco's brilliance as a canonist stems in no small part from his pastoral experience as a priest and bishop. His scholarly insight is never self-referential, but always focused on the people of God and the building up of the mystical body of Christ. Deep-level comparative law uncovers the philosophical underpinnings of diverse legal systems. Corecco's identification of communio as the ontological ground for the juridic structures of canon law contrasts with legal positivism, a prevailing theory in contemporary jurisprudence. According to legal positivism's separation thesis, the description of law needs to be independent from moral judgments. The question of what the law is remains distinct from what the law ought to be. The early legal positivists, such as Jeremy Bentham, grounded the law on the principle of utility, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The efficacy of law, of a legal system, should be judged, according to the positivist, by the application of the principle of utility. Bentham viewed natural law as, and this is a quote, archaic nonsense built on stilts. John Austin also rejected natural law, in his own words, as ambiguous and misleading. This was an explicit rejection of the medieval synthesis developed by figures such as Gratian and Thomas Aquinas, that positive law was to be measured against its conformity to divine law, as found in Revelation, and to natural law, as discovered through the use of human reason. For the legal positivist, law is derived from social facts alone. In his mainstream 20th century case for legal positivism, H.L.A. Hart maintains the separation thesis and rejects natural law. However, he did not think that law could be approached as a hard science simply through empirical verification. He describes his famous book, The Concept of Law, as an essay in descriptive sociology. Unlike the hard sciences, Hart maintained that law is a human creation which serves human purposes. The method of hard science is too limited to understand law and legal institutions. To understand a legal system, Hart argues one must understand the internal aspect of how the people who participate in a legal system perceive it. He posits that a legal system requires a rule of recognition agreed upon by the participants by which they identify valid laws. Hart understands this feature to be characteristic of a developed legal system, affording stability, predictability, and consistency of legal outcomes. It is law derived from social facts and not from extraneous moral beliefs. Hart described legal positivism as an intersystemic understanding of law which maintains the autonomy of law from other normative sources. In direct contrast to Corecco's view, the legal positivist would insist that law's autonomy requires its separation from theology. Legal positivism has been described as almost inherently anti-metaphysical. Corecco refers to Vatican II's theology of communio as, and I quote, the ontological substratum of the 1983 Code. Corecco proposes that canon law helps to set the necessary conditions for a way of life based on the gospel law of love, grounded in communio. This rich ontological foundation for the law transcends mere functionality and utility. It embraces the theology of Vatican II as underpinning a religious system that aims to foster not only individual holiness, but also a new social order based on faith. The comparative analysis thus contrasts the positivist view of law based on social facts with Corecco's understanding of the unity of law and theology. Although positivism represents a predominant contemporary jurisprudence, it stands alongside other views of law, such as natural law, interpretivism, legal realism, critical legal studies, and feminist jurisprudence. Each proposes an answer to the question, what is law? As a representative of a major religious legal system with its unity of law and theology, Corecco has added his clarion voice to the ongoing conversation about what is law. Number 2, canon law as an ordinatio fidei. Corecco identifies canon law as an ordinatio fidei. In his words, canon law must be defined as an ordinatio fidei because it is not produced by any one human legislator, but by the Church, whose decisive epistemological criteria is faith, not reason. This raises a question about the correct relation between faith and reason in canon law. Although he describes canon law as an ordinance of faith, reason still plays a critical role in the science of canon law. First, Corecco's identification of canon law as an ordinance of faith needs to be understood within the context of the long-established Catholic tradition about the complementarity of faith and reason. In Fides et Ratio, John Paul II affirmed that faith and reason need not be in conflict, but rather they complement each other. The complementarity enables the human person to understand the harmony of theological and philosophical truths. Faith perfects reason, allowing it to explore mysteries and truths that lie beyond its natural capacity alone. Faith without reason withers into superstition and emotionalism, losing its universality and intellectual rigor. Reason without faith runs the danger of irrationalism, limited to utility, and absent the capacity to inquire about the ultimate meaning of life. Second, Corecco's focus on canon law as an ordinance of faith should not be construed to repudiate the Catholic epistemological tradition in which faith and reason are interrelated but autonomous ways of knowing in the human subject. Faith is a gift from God, which embraces belief that transcends what can be proven by mere reason. Faith is a way of knowing that often relies on revelation, intuition, and experience rather than on purely analytical and abstract reason. As John Cottingham puts it, if we suppose that there is a God who desires humans to turn towards him, there's no a priori reason to suppose that the methods for such conversion will have to confine themselves exclusively to the resources of analytical intellect. Reason is a faculty in the human person for inquiry, reflection, understanding, and judgment. Thomas Aquinas considered reason to be a unitary power of the human intellect with speculative and practical dimensions. Speculative reason understands theological truths, while practical reason is reason for action and remains essential to the formation of law. Through the use of practical reason, the human person has the capacity to understand certain natural truths and shape them into law, even if that person does not have the gift of faith. Speculative reason produces the theology upon which legal norms are fashioned through the use of practical reason. Over-reliance on faith can lead to a fideism in which faith blithely ignores truths that can be demonstrated by reason. Likewise, an excessive confidence in reason yields a rationalism that operates beyond its boundaries to assert there can be no truth other than that which can be empirically proven. While faith and reason are complementary, it is an epistemic principle of the Catholic tradition that each has its own legitimate realm of authority, warranting mutual respect. Third, the complementarity of faith and reason is evident in the methodology for the framing of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. Theology itself can be described as the use of speculative reason to reflect upon faith. faith seeking understanding through reason, fides quaerens intellectum, remains an essential element of theology. Corecco describes the theology of communio as the ontological substratum of canon law. However, I do not interpret his work to mean that the theology of communio is canon law per se. Canon law is neither absolutely synonymous with communio nor solely theological. Rather, it is a bridge discipline that translates theological beliefs into practical norms for the life of the church. Major sections of the 1983 Code often start with an introductory canon that is drawn from the documents of Vatican II. The canons are thus introduced from the starting point of the theology of Vatican II. The methodology of canon law is to develop legal provisions based on the theology of Vatican II through the use of practical reason. When Corecco writes that canon law is an ordinatio fidei, I understand him to mean that faith enjoys a priority over reason in the epistemology and methodology of canon law. The priority of faith over reason is not to suggest that Corecco rejects the role of reason in canon law. As long as the principle of the priority of faith is maintained, it seems to me that canon law can rightly be described as both an ordinance of faith and an ordinance of reason. The priority of faith over reason in Corecco's thought is a response to major post-Enlightenment shifts in the understanding of reason. Alistair MacIntyre delineates three rival conceptions of reason as hallmarks of contemporary thought. The traditional conception of reason, espoused by Thomas Aquinas, holds that every human person has the capacity to know certain basic goods and principles. It envisions participation in a community whose members are united around a living tradition relying on certain canonical texts. These texts serve as the source of inviolable truths, such as the fundamental dignity of each human person. Corecco qualifies Thomas Aquinas' classic definition of law as an ordinance of reason promulgated for the common good by one who has care of the community. Corecco points out that for Thomas, there was no opposition between faith and reason because he assumed the subordination of ratio to fides. Since the Enlightenment, MacIntyre observes that this traditional conception has been challenged by two post-Enlightenment approaches to reason. The encyclopedic notion of reason stresses that theological truths and natural law represent a limited understanding of reason fostered by thinkers such as Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. According to this second conception of reason, antiquated notions of reason were long ago abrogated in favor of Descartes' pure reason, which requires that all claims be subject to critical, neutral, and disinterested evaluation. The third competing conception of reason, adopted by the genealogist, rejects all claims of neutrality and disinterestedness, seeing them as covers for subjective interest and the desire for power. MacIntyre attributes this conception of reason to Nietzsche. It holds that truths derived from natural law and divine revelation are nothing more than fabrications of the powerful to take advantage of the powerless. Corecco observes that the modern understandings of reason have so displaced the traditional one that faith is no longer accepted as a point of reference for the bonum commune. Since the Enlightenment, Corecco notes that reason has become untethered from faith, and pure reason alone has become the ultimate and unappealable criterion of all human action. Corecco's emphasis on canon law as an ordinance of faith is a response to secularity, in which faith is privatized and severed from reason. For Corecco, canon law is to be grounded in the gospel law of love and not in a concept of reason incompatible with faith. Only an understanding of reason, intrinsically informed by faith, he says, is capable of producing a juridical order fully in accord with communio. Corecco was a man of deep prayer and apostolic mission. who spent years of his life as a university professor, keenly aware of competing conceptions of reason. His embrace of the gospel law of love is, in his words, without secular compromises. It means that Jesus' teaching of the Beatitudes, his healing ministry, his humble service, his Eucharistic gratitude, and self-sacrificial love constitute the theological foundation of canon law. The contemplative perspective that arises in the believer integrates faith and reason. As evident in Corecco's work, the contemplative guides the interpretation of texts and their application to specific historical circumstances. In light of the complementarity between faith and reason, I would like to raise a question from the outlook of comparative law about the power of canon law to bind. Austin asked how we distinguish law from other rules in society which are enforced by opinion. In response, he advanced the command theory of law, according to which the sovereign commands and the subject obeys, backed by threat of force for noncompliance. Although the command theory of the early legal positivists is rightly criticized as an inadequate explanation of law, secular law would be gravely diminished if it could not be enforced through the judicial imposition of penalties such as fines and imprisonment. In contrast, canon law largely depends on voluntary compliance. It has a limited number of penalties, such as excommunication, suspension of a cleric, and involuntary dismissal from the clerical state. In our modern secular world, the fact remains that in the face of such a canonical penalty, the individual is free to leave the church. Where does the power of canon law to bind individuals come from, absent coercive power? Corecco answers this question. Canon law, he says, has a binding force much greater than that of secular law, as it is more profoundly rooted in the normativity of the jus divinum. In fact, it is a law that, unlike the secular one, does not pretend to require obedience at a merely ethical level. Canon law goes to the very level of the ultimate and supernatural destiny of human beings and their salvation, end quote. Corecco assumes that the believer perceives a connection between the law and one's supernatural destiny as a rational basis for voluntary compliance. He's critical of what he describes as a voluntaristic rigidity, which creates an imbalance in the relation between reason and will. Although secular governments characteristically enforce their law with coercive power, an important question remains about the law's legitimacy. Jürgen Habermas has suggested that compliance with law in modern democracies depends on understanding a rational motive that the law is worthy of respect and not merely on fear of sanctions. According to Habermas, the law's legitimacy or power to bind the individual rests on rational discourse in which those subject to the law have the opportunity to participate in the democratic process which leads to the adoption of norms. As Corecco indicates, the church is not governed by parliamentary majority acts, but is a community of faith. Nonetheless, the rational motive that affords the insight for voluntary compliance with canon law remains indispensable. This comparative perspective in no way detracts from canon law's ultimate aim, the salvation of souls, but deepens our understanding of canon law. It clarifies Corecco's view of canon law as an ordinance of faith while maintaining a healthy respect for the role of reason. 3. Canon law and Christian anthropology. Vatican II's understanding of the human person stands at the center of canon law. In Corecco's words, and I quote, "The ultimate force of canon law is the whole anthropological reality, internal and external, of the human person," end quote. In a series of addresses to the Roman Rota, Pope John Paul II called attention to the significance of Christian anthropology for canon law. The pontiff stated, "The Church's whole work of evangelization, and thus canonical legislation itself, is directed towards human beings, created in the image of God, redeemed by the sacrifice of Christ, and made his brothers and sisters, end quote. The pontiff taught that canon law rests upon an integrated concept of the person which allows human beings to tend towards the love of God and of their neighbor as their final vocation. He elaborated, Christian anthropology considers the human person under every aspect, terrestrial and eternal, natural and transcendent. Christian anthropology attributes a theological and a natural dignity to the human person. According to Gaudium et Spes, the theological dignity of the human person is found in the biblical narrative of the creation of humanity in the image of God, imago Dei. Humanity suffers from the disorder of sin, but is redeemed by the absolute self-sacrificial love of Christ. Christ is the perfect image of God, and to understand humanity fully, one must look to Christ. He is the model and ultimate destiny for humanity. In this sense, to be fully human is to be fully divine. Klaus Merstorff drew a nexus between the theological dignity of human persons and canon law. In his memoirs, Joseph Ratzinger fondly recalls the impact of Merstorff's idea on his own theological formation. And I quote Ratzinger, Merstorff conceived of canon law as belonging to the very center of theology by virtue of the incarnation. That is, a logical consequence of becoming a man. The Word has thus associated himself with the necessity of institutional and legal forms, end quote. Merstorff understood the theology of the incarnation to justify the development of legal structures in the church based on the divine taking on human flesh. Christ inaugurates a new form of human law characterized by intimacy with God and self-transcendent love for others. Corecco sees Merstorff's Christological approach to canon law as a response to the critique that the church was a spiritual rather than a juridical reality, and that the nature of canon law is in contradiction to the nature of the church. Merstorff's incarnational principle attributes a nobility to canon law as sacred norms. Canon law promotes essential elements for the continuity of Christ's redemptive work in human history. Canon law serves to facilitate preaching, witness to faith, worship, celebration of the sacraments, social justice, works of mercy, and the development of doctrine in the church. Canon law is not an end in itself, but only an imperfect means to the end. The theological understanding of the human person that underpins canon law avoids a twofold error. First, that one can obtain salvation through mere observance of the law, and second, that observance of the law is irrelevant to salvation. Vatican II's Christian anthropology also attributes a natural dignity to the human person as a social being endowed with reason, conscience, and free will. Human beings need opportunities for participation, membership, and solidarity in order to prosper. There's a natural law principle that where there is society, there is law. Ubi societas, ibi et jus. Corecco objects to the justification of canon law solely on the principle ubi societas, ibi et jus. He acknowledges that the principle provides, and I quote, an anthropological meaning for the notion of law and avoids an excessive spiritualization of the jus divinum. However, Corecco cautions that unlike secular law, canon law is not generated by a dynamism spontaneous biological to human social life, but by the specific one inherent in the nature of the church, whose social nature is genetically produced by grace and is knowable only through faith. The church is a human institution, and as such it needs law, but the church is first and foremost the sacrament of Christ's love in the world. The justification and purpose of the church's law is embedded in this theological reality. Corecco calls, and I quote, for an anthropological meaning for the notion of law which respects the church as a spiritual community and at the same time avoids an excessive spiritualization of law. Corecco states that, and again I quote, "Grace is law only in an analogical sense, because the essence of a new law does not reside formally on its legal character, but in the fact that it is given as grace." The relation between canon law and Christian anthropology is grounded in the principle that grace perfects nature and does not destroy it. Gratiat non tollit naturam, sed proficiat. In Christian anthropology, nature and grace are not two distinct dichotomous categories, but deeply interrelated gifts from God. The relationship between nature and grace in Christian anthropology raises the issue of natural law. Corecco's view of natural law is also shaped by his theological focus. He states that the unity between divine law and human canon law need not necessarily be established by the mediation of natural law, end quote. Corecco's hesitation about natural law reflects his concern that in modernity, reason has been severed from faith. Jacques Maritain proposes an understanding of natural law that fully integrates faith and reason. Maritain thought that Aristotle's idea of natural law was incomplete because it lacked an understanding of humanity's supernatural end, the vision of God, which can only be known through faith. Maritein's understanding of natural law recognizes the human person as a spiritual being with a relationship to God, moral values, institutions, and law. According to Maritain, natural law exists, and I quote, because the human essence is an ontological reality, which moreover does not exist separately, but in every human being, as it dwells as an ideal order in the very being of every existing man, end quote. He observed that, and I quote, the genuine concept of canon law, of natural law is the concept which is natural not only insofar as it expresses the normativity of functioning of human nature, but also insofar as is naturally known, that is through inclination or through co-naturality, not through conceptual knowledge and by way of reasoning, end quote. Co-naturality means that persons with virtuous dispositions can apprehend moral truth through inclination rather than through abstract reasoning alone. One common human nature, shared by all persons, to draw the human person towards certain fundamental goods, such as preserving life, recognizing human dignity, reasonableness, and sociability. These natural goods, known through practical reason, are components of Christian anthropology. They afford the ontological ground for the reciprocity of rights and responsibilities of the human person as a moral agent in society. In accord with this anthropological perspective, Maritain thought that although natural law derives from human reason, its fullness can only be completely understood through faith. The unified vision of the human person and its significance for canon law embraces both natural and supernatural aspects. From a comparative law perspective, the anthropological justification for canon law enriches the conversation about human rights. Maritain served as a central figure in the drafting of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He commented that the impetus that led to the adoption of this seminal document was the practical necessity of addressing the recurrent barbarisms of the human situation, rather than the diverse philosophical, religious, and political motivations of the various signatories of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Maritein's success in galvanizing support for the document derived from his view of natural law. He was able to build consensus based on the shared intuition of the document's signatories about safeguarding human dignity through a recognition of basic rights. Since the adoption of the Declaration, securing human rights on the basis of human dignity has proved challenging. The concept of human dignity has been criticized as too abstract, exclusively Western, and imperialistic. Christian anthropology's theological and philosophical justifications of human dignity as a basis for fundamental rights offers a valuable insight. The insight corrects a tendency in certain individualistic approaches to the interpretation of human rights. The individualistic interpretation of human rights stresses individual political rights, such as freedom of speech and due process of law. As important as these individuals' rights are in a just legal system, their exclusive emphasis tends to produce a negative conception of human freedom as the absence of government restraint on the individual. Other secular systems of law prioritize communitarian approaches to rights. Communitarian approaches to human rights aim to afford public goods, such as healthcare, housing, and education. While these kinds of public goods remain vital to individual flourishing, communitarianism can defile personal autonomy, stifle individual initiative, and place the state above the human person. Christian anthropology eschews a false dichotomy between human rights as individualistic and communal. In positing human dignity as the foundation of rights, the anthropology attempts to balance the significance of individual autonomy with the benefits of participation, membership, and solidarity in community. The balance can be detected in the so-called Lex Ecclesiae Fundamentalis of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. It's Canons 208 to 223, titled The Obligation and Rights of All the Christian Faithful. The exercise of individual rights is to be balanced with the common good. These rights are not absolute, but qualified. In Corecco's view, the Code represents the fulfillment of Vatican II's Christian anthropology with its focus on human dignity as underpinning basic rights. Without diminishing the potency of individual rights, the CIC 1983 balances them with reciprocal responsibilities in the context of community. As Corecco put it, the ultimate end of the canonical order is not simply that of guaranteeing the bonum commune ecclesiae, but of realizing communio. The natural level of the common good is enhanced by the theological grounding of rights in communio. Corecco well understood that Christian anthropology can only lead to an even greater esteem for humans' sublime nobility, their inviolable rights. He generously answered God's call to be present in the world by putting human persons at the center of his Catholic life, service, and love. He dedicated his life to helping others, and we are all enriched by his gentle, humble, humane, and courageous example. Thank you very much.